Today, I want to talk to you about using active and passive voice. That's coming up. Hey everyone, my name is Wes. This is Interactive English, which is all about helping you practice and improve your English skills. Today, I have a grammar lesson for you. It's all about active and passive voice. I want to tell you, well, what is the difference between active and passive? How do you change sentences from active voice to passive voice? And when should you use the passive voice? Because I think that can confuse learners from time to time. The reason why I'm doing this is because often in the comments I get questions and people are like, well, hey, how do you change this sentence to the passive voice? It made me realize that, okay, this is valuable information for you to know about when and how to use active and passive voice. So when you're thinking about, okay, let's start with the sentences that we can change from active to passive. So the first thing that I want to do is focus on the verb. And the verb tense does not matter. What really matters is what follows the verb. Does an object follow the verb? Because if it does, then we can change it to the passive voice. Let me give you some more information about that. So verbs can either be transitive or intransitive. If a verb is transitive, it means that it has an object in order to help complete the meaning of the sentence. For example, the verb buy. We will follow that with an object because it tells us, well, what the person is buying. I buy some food. Subject, verb, object. So if a verb has an object, then it is a transitive verb. If a verb is intransitive, then, well, that just means that there is no object. The verb will likely be followed by a prepositional phrase or maybe even an adverb. Think about the verb laugh, all right? You know what the meaning of that is. And I could say the sentence, she laughs at the joke. Subject, verb, prepositional phrase. Or I could say, they laughed immediately. Subject, verb, adverb. Now, there are some verbs that can be either transitive or intransitive. Let's look at the verb eat. I could say, we will eat the sandwiches. Talking about the future, I have my subject, verb, and the sandwiches, that is my object. Now, I can use that same verb and follow it with a prepositional phrase and say, well, we will eat in the park. In that case, I have subject, verb, prepositional phrase. It is intransitive. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all of this, because you may be thinking, what the heck does this have to do with active and passive voice? If a verb is intransitive, you cannot change it to the passive voice. So all of those sentences that I just talked about that were intransitive, she laughs at the joke, they laughed immediately, we will eat in the park. Those sentences cannot be changed to the passive voice. In order to change a sentence from active to passive, or even just to use the passive, you need to have an object. So now you know the types of sentences that you can change to the passive voice. They must be transitive verbs. Let's look at the difference between active, passive, how to change it, and when to use that passive voice. So I think just in general, the main difference between active voice and passive voice is that with active voice, the subject is performing the action. When you're using the passive voice, the subject is receiving the action. Keep in mind that the vast majority of the time, you're going to use the active voice. When you're speaking, you're going to use active voice, and when you're writing, you're going to be writing those active sentences. The reason for this is because active voice, it's more direct, and the focus is on the actor. It is on the subject that is performing the action. For example, I could say, Wes teaches English. It's direct, it's easy to understand, and the focus is on, Wes. Who is doing the action? The subject is doing the action. So the vast majority of the time, just know, all right, you are going to use the active voice. There are certain instances in which it's common to use the passive voice. And I want to talk to you about 4 different times in which you may want to use the passive voice and why. And as we go through this, I'm going to give you some examples, and we're going to change the sentences from active to passive. So let's begin with the first one, which is when you want to emphasize the action over the actor. This is a great example of when you would want to use the passive voice. So let's take the sentence, I wrote that email. This is an active sentence. Subject, verb, object. Now, if we want to change this to the passive voice, we are going to take the object and move it to the front of the sentence. Then you are going to add the verb to be plus the past participle plus the phrase by and the subject. So let's look at this change a bit closer. We have our active sentence. I wrote that email. That email, that's the object. I'm going to move it to the front of the sentence. Then I'm going to follow it with the verb to be. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind is the verb tense, because in the active sentence, wrote is in the simple past. So that means I need to use the verb to be in the simple past. That email was, then the past participle. The main verb in the active sentence is write. The past participle is written. Write, wrote, written. That email was written by me. All right, that is the subject. The subject gets moved to the end. Notice the subject changes from a subject pronoun to an object pronoun. So in our active sentence, we're going to use the subject pronoun I, you, he, she, it, we, they. If we're changing it to the passive, then it's going to become an object pronoun, me. Me, you, him, her, us, them, those are object pronouns. One other thing that I think is important is subject-verb agreement, because in this case, I'm saying that email was written. If in my active sentence, I were to say, well, I wrote those emails, and the object is plural, that's going to change the subject-verb agreement. Then I would say those emails were written. So that's something you need to pay close attention to when changing from active to passive. Is the object singular or is the object plural? So this is kind of a difficult example to start out with because there are many changes that are occurring. You have a simple sentence like, I wrote that email, and you're going to change it to the passive. That email was written by me. And again, I told you in this sense, you might use the passive if you want to emphasize the action over the actor. Another time that you may want to use the passive voice is when you want to avoid identifying the actor. You want to avoid identifying that subject. So let's take an active sentence. We made mistakes. We have our subject, verb, and our object. Our object is mistakes. Let's now change it to the passive. And this time we're going to avoid identifying the actor. So I would take mistakes. I'm going to move it to the front of the sentence. Mistakes were, because again, we're talking about the past tense, and then the past participle, made. Mistakes were made, finished. I don't want to identify who made the mistakes. And the reason why is because, well, we made the mistakes. So in this example, I think of government and politicians because they don't want to admit when they made a mistake. So instead of going up there and saying, well, look, sorry, everyone, we made mistakes, they would get up there and they would use the passive voice and say, well, mistakes were made. And in that case, they are not identifying themselves because people would hate them for it. And this is a way for them to avoid responsibility. So in this example, I tend to think of politicians. I know I'm rather cynical. Instead of saying, oh, we made mistakes, they might say mistakes were made, and they avoid identifying the actor. Another time in which you may want to use the passive voice is when the actor is unknown. We don't know who the subject is that is performing that action. For example, let's take the sentence, someone stole my bike. Subject, verb, object. Now let's change it to the passive. We're going to take the object, move it to the front. My bike. Follow it with the verb to be. Was, because it was the past tense. My bike was plus the past participle stolen. So we have my bike was stolen by, well, we don't know who the person is. In the active voice, I just said someone. I use the indefinite pronoun. But if we're changing this to the passive, you don't need to say by someone. It's not necessary. We don't know who it is. You just say, oh, my bike was stolen. So this is a great example as to when you would use the passive when you don't know who the actor is. My bike was stolen. My wallet was stolen. Those are examples of when I think it's pretty common that you may hear someone use the passive, or maybe you want to use the passive voice as well. Another time in which you may want to use the passive is when you want to have a firm tone. You're giving a command, you want to be firm, but you also want to be polite as well. So this is a great example of when you may hear someone using the passive, or you can use it too. So let's start with just a general command, which is no talking. So if we want to change this to the passive, it can be a little tricky. So let's expand that sentence out to we do not allow talking. Now we have something to work with and can change it to the passive voice. So we're going to take talking, we're going to move it to the front, we're going to follow it with the verb to be in the present tense. Talking is not, because we're talking about something in the negative. Talking is not allowed. That is the past participle. And that's basically how you would say it. You don't need to identify the actor. You're giving a command. It's understood. So you would just say, talking is not allowed. And I said it's a little more polite because if somebody's going to tell you, hey, no talking, I think that can come off as a little rude. Instead, I think it's a little more polite to just say, hey, talking is not allowed. So these are 4 great examples as to when you may want to try and use the passive voice, or you may likely hear somebody else using the passive voice. So let's practice a little bit. I want to go back through each and every one of these instances. I'm going to give you a sentence in the active voice, and I want you to change it to the passive, and I want you to say the passive sentence out loud. I'll give you a moment to think about it, and then I will tell you the answer. And I'm going to try and give you sentences that I think are relevant, that I think people would actually say in the passive voice. So let's begin with that first instance in which you may want to emphasize the action over the actor. And the sentence that I'm going to give you is this one right here. My ancestors farmed this land. Change it to the passive voice. I'll make it a little easier for you. All right, I'm giving you part of the answer right here. What would you say? How would you change this to the passive? I hope that you said in the passive voice, this land was farmed by my ancestors. And this is something, you may want to emphasize that, especially if maybe something is going to happen to the land. We can't destroy this land. This land was farmed by my ancestors. It's very important to me. The next sentence that I want you to change, and I want you to avoid identifying the actor, is this one. They will put their dog to sleep. It's a sad sentence. It's a fact of life. If you don't know what it means, to put an animal to sleep is basically to kill the animal, mostly because of old age or they're sick and they have a poor quality of life. So you could say in the active voice, they will put their dog to sleep. How would you change it to the passive? Here is part of it. How would you complete that sentence? I hope that all of you said their dog will be put to sleep. We're talking about something that will happen in the future, will be put. In this case, you're not identifying the actor. You're not saying by them. If you're talking to somebody else about this family situation and you know it's difficult for them, you're just going to tell somebody what would happen without identifying the actor and say, their dog will be put to sleep. The next one is when the actor is unknown, and this time I have a question for you. I want you to change this question from the active to the passive. And that question is, has anyone fed the cat? This is a question in the active voice. How would you change it to the passive? And I'm not going to give you any hints this time. So what do you think? Has anyone fed the cat? Again, the actor is unknown. We have that indefinite pronoun anyone. So if we change this to the passive, I think a very common question someone might ask is, has the cat been fed? We're still using the present perfect in the question, and the grammar is going to remain the same. Has the cat. Remember, that object is going to move to the front, and it will go after that helping verb. Has the cat, the verb to be, been, plus the past participle, fed. Has the cat been fed? We don't need to say by anyone because, well, it's not really relevant. We don't know. So it's very common just to ask, hey, has the cat been fed? And then I have a command for you that I want you to change, and that is no smoking. Now, we did this before. I gave you that example, no talking. I want you to change no smoking to the passive, but I don't want you to use the word not. And because of that, I really want you to think about what verb should you use? What verb is commonly used? And this is actually, I think, a sign that you may see quite often out in public. Let's stretch this out. I'll make it a little easier for you. The verb you could use is prohibit. We prohibit smoking. And then if I give you that, I think it's much easier to change and make a passive sentence, and you would say, smoking is prohibited. Smoking is prohibited, passive voice. It's a firm tone, but it's also, I think, a little more polite than just saying, hey, no smoking. Just tell somebody smoking is prohibited. So I hope you have a perfect understanding of active voice, passive voice, how to change these sentences, as well as when to use the passive voice. I think that is very important because, like I said, most of the time you are going to use the active voice. What I want you to do right now is let's do some more practice. I want you to write an active sentence in the comments. And then I want you to go to someone else's comment, reply to their comment, and change it to the passive. So what I want is just to have this long list of comments in the active, and then you can respond to those comments and change the sentence from active to passive. So this is a great way to continue practicing active voice, passive voice, and changing sentences from active to passive. If you enjoyed this lesson, please hit that like button. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.